Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into something strangely ordinary yet endlessly fascinating, the way people once slept. Not the neat 8-hour block we imagine today, but broken nights, crowded straw beds, whispered prayers against demons, and the odd habits of a world that never really went quiet. This is boring history for sleep. Long, quiet stories told by your sleepy historian here at Historian Sleepy 365. If you're new, think of me as a companion for the night. My voice won't rush, won't thrill, but it will carry you through history in slow, steady waves, just enough to let your mind settle. Before we drift further, if these quiet journeys help you rest, you can subscribe to the channel. It keeps these long, sleepy stories coming, the kind of history to fall asleep to whenever you need it. So let the lights dim, lay back. Imagine the soft scratch of straw, the chill of stone walls, or the restless stir of a monastery dormitory. We're going to wander from medieval nights, through witch trials, through the forgotten life of a Roman woman, and finally to a dream shouted across Washington. All connected by sleep, by dreams, and by the long, strange story of how humans have always tried to rest. Close your eyes now. Let's begin. Imagine a medieval night. The sun sets early. By 4 in the winter, the world is already dim. There are no electric lights, no artificial glow to extend the evening. People live by the rhythm of darkness and moonlight. Supper is eaten quickly. Cleanup is brief. A short prayer at the wooden altar. Then each person finds a place to lie down and rest. The idea of sleeping for 8 unbroken hours never existed. Instead, life followed a different rhythm. 2 separate sleeps in a single night, with a quiet waking in between. The first sleep began not long after nightfall, usually around 8 or 9. People wrapped themselves in coarse cloth, laying close together on damp straw beds or dry grass spread across the floor. That sleep would last 3 to 4 hours until the body naturally stirred around midnight. To them, this was no disorder, no sign of insomnia. It was the normal rhythm of a world without artificial light. When you live in a society where the sun decides everything, your body breaks the night into pieces, resting in patterns shaped by light and dark. Waking in the middle of the night brought with it a kind of stillness. In many European languages, this time was known simply as the watch. In the dim house, the hearth had begun to die down. Someone would rise to stoke it. The wood cracked in the fire, its red light flickering across earthen walls. Some used that time to pray, reading quiet lines of Latin from a tiny book, if they were lucky enough to own one. Some whispered with the person lying beside them, sharing small stories or planning the work for morning. Some couples used this hour for intimacy. Old medical texts even recommended it, saying the body, half rested and the mind still clear, was most suited for closeness between the 2 sleeps. Picture a small wooden cottage in 14th century England, a family of 4 curled up on a bed of straw, sharing warmth against the winter cold. When they wake, the father tiptoes to the hearth, a stick in hand to poke the coals. The mother lights a small candle. Its pale glow spreads across her tired face. Outside, wind whistles through the cracks in the door, rattling the animal hide stretched across the window frame. Far off, the church bell tolls the midnight hour, each note slow and distant, echoing through the village. It paints a picture dim and hushed, peaceful, yet quietly laced with solitude. In many old writings, first sleep and second sleep appear as if self-evident. A 16th century French court record notes a farmer witnessing a theft after waking from his first sleep. A medieval medical book reassures patients that if they wake at midnight, there's no need to worry. It simply means the first rest is done. Even literature makes mention, from Chaucer to Shakespeare. Lines scattered here and there reveal a world that found comfort in a night split in two. Centuries later, historian Roger E. Kirch would gather hundreds of such references, showing that segmented sleep once stretched across all of Europe for hundreds of years. Seen from today, it might feel strange. Now, if you wake at 2 a.m., you reach for your phone. Thumb scrolling, blue light blinking silently into your eyes. But the medieval sleeper woke too. And instead of a glowing screen, they had the flicker of a candle, a whispered prayer, or the stillness of a winter night. What we call insomnia, they called life. If modern sleep is like a film played straight through, then medieval sleep was a play with two acts and a quiet intermission in the middle. This waking period had purpose. It was the time to check on the family's safety, to tend the fire so the house wouldn't freeze, to pray, to push back the fear of night. And it was a moment for quiet self-confrontation. In monasteries, this middle hour aligned with matins, the night prayers. Monks would rise, pull on heavy cloaks and walk down cold stone corridors, their breath misting into the air. Bells rang long and low, chanting filled the darkness, then they would return to their beds to begin the second sleep. It wasn't a disruption, it was a cycle, sacred and familiar. From an anthropological view, segmented sleep was simply how humans adapted to a world without electricity. Only with the arrival of streetlights, electric bulbs, and industrial timekeeping did 8-hour sleep become the rule. What we now call normal is just one version of history, not a law of nature. In other places, echoes of broken sleep still remain. In Spain, the afternoon siesta lives on. Vietnamese farmers once nodded off many times through the day. This straight line of modern sleep is only a few centuries old, but the broken rhythm nurtured generations. If you close your eyes and imagine, it's the 13th century. You're in a stone monastery in France. After your first sleep, you rise and walk into the cold corridor, a small candle in hand. Its flicker lights the rough walls. The sound of your leather sandals echo. Distant bells ring. Night wind whistles through the gaps. You sit on a wooden bench, fingers tracing beads of prayer, eyes half closed to the soft chant in the air. Then you return to your bed, pull the coarse blanket over your shoulders, and drift into the second sleep until the sky brightens. It isn't continuous, but it is complete, like breath, which rises and falls, like a heartbeat, sometimes steady, sometimes slow. To the medieval mind, this was balance, the quiet order of a life lived by firelight. If you stepped into a medieval European peasant's home, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be warmth or comfort, but the sharp, earthy scent of old straw, of damp soil rising from the floor, and of clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks. In that cramped space, the bed was nothing like what we imagine today. No sturdy wooden frame, no soft cotton mattress, no crisp, clean sheets. What they called a bed was simply a pile of dry straw, sometimes covered with rough cloth or animal hide to keep the moisture out. They called it by plain names, a truss, a pallet. Words that offered no illusion of comfort, only a place to lie down. On that pile of straw, the whole family slept together, parents, children, even visiting relatives. Sleeping wasn't personal, it was shared. Not out of choice, but because of how life was. On cold winter nights, it took the warmth of many bodies to keep the frost at bay. Small children were tucked between their parents. Adults pressed close, barely able to move. They all shared a single coarse blanket, often made of worn linen or threadbare wool, sometimes just a roughly treated hide. But this closeness wasn't always gentle. Dry straw had company, lice, fleas, mites, uninvited but ever present. When one person scratched, everyone knew. Old manuscripts even describe children giggling as they watched their older siblings scratch their heads in the night. But the laughter was laced with discomfort. Lice could carry disease, and damp homes were the perfect breeding ground. People had tricks, sprinkling sharp-smelling herbs like mugwort or costmary into the straw, hoping to ward off the bugs. But most of the time, they simply endured. In wealthier households, the bed might be lifted on a wooden frame. Planks laid beneath the straw to raise it off the ground. But even for them, the idea of a soft mattress was distant. Only the grandest castles held beds stuffed with goose feathers. For most common folk, straw remained the standard well into the early modern era. Even in sleep, society revealed its layers. For peasants, each night was a negotiation, with cold, with damp, with itching skin. For nobles, sleep was luxury, wrapped in velvet, framed by lace. And it wasn't just the family. In many places, guests were folded into the same bed. A traveller might share the straw pile with the host and their children. To us, it may seem strange. But in the medieval world, it was normal. Homes were too small for privacy, and the culture didn't see shared sleep as unusual. Records even tell of travellers bedding down in roadside homes, chatting warmly in the morning, as though sharing a bed was simply part of being welcomed. In the dark, snores, children's cries, the rustle of shifting bodies, all blended into a rough lullaby of daily life. Medieval people were used to the noise. Sleep was never truly silent. Add to that the scurry of mice, a barking dog outside, wind slipping through thatch, a church bell tolling in the distance. Sleep was something dreamlike, but interrupted, fragmented. Yet no one complained. They didn't know anything else. A few 13th century travel diaries describe the experience. One pilgrim wrote of sharing a straw bed with 5 strangers, and of being bitten so often he could hardly sleep. Another lamented the stink of sweat and smoke clinging to the linen. But even in these complaints was an acceptance. No one expected privacy. No one expected cleanliness. A bed was a place for the body to rest, not a space for dreams of comfort. For children, sleeping on straw was the backdrop of childhood. They heard their parents whispering in the dark, listened to the last embers crackling in the hearth, smelled the mingling of earth and hay. They grew up in shared spaces, where every feeling, every sound, every breath was communal. When sickness came, the family nursed each other right there on the straw. When someone died, the body might be laid in the same room, awaiting burial. There was no clear line between space for the living and space for the dead. The straw bed witnessed it all. And perhaps now, lying on a spring mattress or memory foam, it's hard to imagine a world where sleep was a continuous compromise. The medieval poor had no choice. They accepted the crowding, the itching, the cold. But in those nights, they learned to live closely, to share each flicker of warmth, each inch of space. The straw bed wasn't just where people slept. It was woven into the fabric of their communal life. It held their laughter, their tears, their dreams, and their quiet fears, in a world that had never known the privacy we now take for granted. If straw beds were the familiar image of peasant life, then the small objects tied to sleep reveal just how far the medieval night differs from our own. Among them, the sleep cap, or nightcap, was so common, it was almost essential. Men wore them, women wore them, or even children sometimes went to bed with one snug over their heads. It wasn't some quaint habit, it was practical. Medieval houses were cold, roofs leaked, drafts slipped through every board, windows were covered only by cloth or wooden shutters, and the body's heat so carefully preserved during the day, escaped easily into the long night. The nightcap, often made from linen or wool, was little more than a cloth pouch to hug the head and trap what warmth it could. In paintings from the era, you'll sometimes see bearded men lying in bed, wearing pointed caps that look like something from a fairy tale. But to them, it was no costume, it was warmth, a damp head from a rare wash, a gust through a cracked window, or just the habits passed from one generation to the next, all made the nightcap a natural part of bedtime. Many housewives sewed them for the whole family, as if they were just another layer of daily clothing. It wasn't just the cap. Nightwear itself was simple and always practical. Today, we have pajamas. Back then, sleepwear was simply looser versions of what they wore during the day. Men slept in long linen shirts that reached the knees, shirts they'd already worn under coats and trousers all day. Women might sleep in plain underdresses. Changing into a special set of clothes for bed was rare. Fabric was expensive, hard to find. A shirt could be worn day and night, and might only be washed a handful of times in a year. The idea of dressing just to sleep was luxury. In this world, inns offered the clearest look into how little privacy medieval sleep allowed. Along trade routes, pilgrim paths, and travel roads, inns sprang up for passers-by. But don't imagine a quiet room with a bed and a lock on the door. Most inns were just a single large room, lined with straw pallets or shared wooden beds. Those who arrived early chose their spots. Latecomers squeezed in where they could. Strangers lay side by side. No introductions, no boundaries, a farmer beside a merchant, a knight beside a monk, all under the same blanket, or without one at all. Some pilgrim accounts describe this with weary humor. One man wrote that he shared a bed with 3 strangers, one of whom snored like thunder splitting the beams. Another complained he couldn't sleep through the stink of sweat, smoke from the hearth, and even the lingering smell of dung nearby. But most accepted it. This was simply the price of the road. An inn wasn't a place to relax. It was shelter, from rain, from cold, from thieves. Larger inns had wooden bunk beds, long planks lined with straw where guests slept shoulder to shoulder, arms touching, feet tangling, breaths blending in the dark. If one person turned over, the whole row felt it. Crickets chirped, dogs barked below, wind scraped the thatch. And through it all, guests learned to sleep, or at least drift. At times, strangers of different sexes shared beds. Some accounts note that when space was tight, 2 unknown travelers might lie side by side. This, of course, inspired stories, some teasing, some whispered. But most travelers, exhausted from the road, simply collapsed, too tired to care who lay beside them. The idea of a private bed as we know it didn't exist. And sometimes those inns spread more than stories. With dozens, even hundreds of travelers packed together, lice, fleas, and disease traveled too. Local governments occasionally passed laws requiring inns to change out their straw, but these were rarely enforced. Travelers brought their own sleeping sacks when they could, or at least a cloth sheet, a thin layer of defense between skin and infestation. Yet even here, something deeper emerges. Sleep wasn't separate from social life. It was a continuation of it. People talked until sleep took them, sharing news, prayers, laughter, and snores, all in the same breath. There was no hard border between waking and sleeping, between solitude and community. And when dawn came, everyone rose together, whispers, footsteps on wooden floors, doors creaking open, a shared awakening. Sleep in that world was communal, not just within families, but among strangers on the same road. Today, when we look at old European paintings, with people in long nightshirts and pointed caps packed tightly into common inns, it's easy to smile, but every detail was a solution. Nightcaps kept the cold from entering through the roof. Simple sleepwear saved precious cloth. Shared beds kept travelers from freezing on the roadside. Small things. But they were how people endured the long, hard nights of the medieval world. On the long, cold nights of medieval Europe, the chill wasn't just discomfort, it was a real threat to life. Stone walls, thatched roofs, and dirt floors rarely came with the luxury of individual fireplaces. Charcoal was expensive, dry firewood in winter even harder to come by. Most peasant families had to find other ways to stay warm. One of the simplest and most common was sleeping with animals. In small wooden homes, space was often divided in two, one half for people, the other for livestock. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, kept just below the floorboards or even right there in the same room, separated only by a rough wooden partition. They weren't just easier to watch over that way. Their large, breathing bodies gave off warmth, enough to soften the sting of winter air. Farmers slept on straw above the cattle's steady breath. The smell of hay and animal musk filled the room. Hooves scraped against the wood. Cows chewed slowly in the dark. Sheep let out the occasional soft bleat. These weren't disturbances, they were the soundtrack of sleep. It was a simple form of symbiosis. The animals gave warmth, the humans gave food, shelter, and protection. Old proverbs from the time speak half in jest, half in truth. The cow is the poor man's fireplace. Children grew up this way, curled against the flank of a goat, or falling asleep with their arms around the family dog. These animals were warmth, yes, but they were also company. Gentle companions that made the darkness less frightening. To a medieval child, sleeping alongside animals felt natural. Their sleep followed the rhythms of the herd. In monasteries, however, sleep took on a different kind of order. Monks lived by strict rules, and that discipline extended to how, where, and when they slept. They slept in shared dormitories, the dormitorium, long rooms filled with rows of simple wooden beds. Straw mattresses, woolen blankets, no curtains, no walls, no privacy. Monastic sleep was a collective ritual, emphasizing equality and obedience. At appointed hours, the church bells rang through the night, calling the entire brotherhood awake. The monks sat up, left their cold beds, pulled on cloaks and moved through the dark corridors to pray in the chapel. Afterward, they returned to their beds, completing the sacred rhythm. 2 phases of sleep, in harmony with the rhythm of prayer. In the dark dormitorium, the shuffle of robes, the murmur of whispered prayers, the soft steps across stone, all became part of a sleep shaped by service. In some monasteries, even sleeping posture was prescribed. Lying face down was forbidden, seen as a sinful posture. Lying flat on the back, hands folded on the chest, as if always ready to meet God, that was the ideal. Sleep here was never fully personal. It belonged to the religious life. If we imagine these scenes, the farmer sleeping above a snorting ox, the monk resting in the cold order of his row, the contrast is clear. Peasant sleep was messy and full of life, noisy, crowded, shared with animals. Monastic sleep was quiet, orderly, and watched over by bells, not beasts. But they had something in common. Sleep was never truly private. It wasn't something done alone, behind a closed door. It was part of the collective rhythm of life. Today, we think of the bed as the most personal of spaces, a room of one's own with a switch to shut out the world. But in the Middle Ages, sleep was anything but isolated. It was shared, with family, with animals, with a community of monks. Cold, darkness, and scarcity forced people to lean on each other just to make it through the night. To modern readers, those old records stir both sympathy and curiosity. Sympathy because their sleep seems so far removed from the comfort we know. Curiosity because those strange habits, sleeping beside cows, lying in rigid rows, start to make sense in context. In that context, sleep wasn't just rest, it was connection. It was the expression of a world where survival depended less on the individual and more on the group. When a long day of labor came to an end in medieval Europe, when the fire in the hearth dimmed and the house sank into darkness, sleep arrived not just as rest, but as a kind of ritual. People prayed before closing their eyes. It was a habit so common it was nearly expected. Children were taught simple prayers like, "Now I lay me down to sleep," while adults recited longer verses. They believed the night was the hour of demon, that a mind left unguarded could be an easy target. Sleep, to the medieval soul, was a dangerous journey. It was thought that the spirit might leave the body, wander through invisible realms, and only prayer could shield it during that unconscious crossing. In engravings, paintings, and journals of the time, you'll often see demons gathered near the bed. Some illustrations depict a small creature sitting on the sleeper's chest, so heavy it stifles their breath. That sensation, what we now call sleep paralysis, was once blamed on the incubus or succubus, evil spirits said to torment those in bed. They didn't just steal your breath, they planted nightmares, they tempted souls, so sleep became a quiet battle, and a sincere prayer was seen as a weapon against the dark. Fear of nighttime visions runs deep through the records. Some diaries speak of dreams so disturbing that they woke in terror, fires, monsters, the faces of the dead. To them, dreams weren't tricks of the mind, they were messages from God or warnings from the devil. A bad dream might lead someone to confession the next day, might cause them to change their behavior. A good dream, on the other hand, might be seen as a blessing, a small comfort after a hard day's toil. So the night was a space where fear and hope lived side by side. In the black stillness of the house, with wind slipping through the cracks and the distant cry of an owl circling the woods, the medieval sleeper lay in straw and smoke, cradled in the fragile sense of being alive. They prayed, they feared, and then they let go, not certain they'd wake again. To them, rising in the morning was not a given, it was grace. If we turn to other civilizations, we find a shared reverence for the world of dreams. In ancient Egypt, there were entire books dedicated to dreams. One of the most famous, Papyrus Chester Beatty III, listed hundreds of dreams and their meanings. To dream of the river rising, a good omen. To dream of a snake entering the house, bad fortune. The Egyptians believed dreams were messages from the gods, and they catalogued them with care, a kind of sacred knowledge. In Babylon, dreams were political. Priests were the gatekeepers, interpreters between man and the divine. They recorded the dreams of kings, studied their symbols, and used them to guide state decisions. One dream could determine whether to go to war or call for peace. Dreams there weren't personal, they were instruments of empire. In ancient China, dreams were seen through the lens of cosmic balance. Night was divided into 5 watches, each about 2 hours long, and sleep was meant to follow those rhythms. Dreams were linked to the flow of qi, the balance of yin and yang in the body. To dream of fire might suggest excess heat. To dream of water, a sign of kidney imbalance. In Chinese medicine, dreams weren't just mysticism, they were diagnostics. Back in medieval Europe, we see the same pattern. Everywhere, humans looked into the dream and saw something more. They saw God, demons, fate, or illness. Sleep and dreams were never just biological. They were wrapped in layers of culture, faith, and fear. The medieval peasant went to bed exhausted, but also burdened. What dream would come tonight? What shadow might appear? What warning might be whispered? Sleep was both refuge and threshold, a place where control was lost and the invisible could slip through. And so they prayed, they trusted, they braced themselves. The comparisons with Egypt, Babylon, and China remind us, no matter where, humans tried to understand their dreams, so they wouldn't feel alone in the dark. In Egypt, they wrote them down. In Babylon, they shaped nations. In China, they flowed with cosmic rhythms. And in medieval Europe, they were inseparable from faith and from the terror of unseen evil. Each culture explained them differently, but all agreed on one thing: dreams matter. Today, when we wake at 2 a.m. and reach for a glowing screen, it's hard to imagine a farmer sitting up in the dark with a pounding heart, whispering a prayer to banish a demon before daring to fall back asleep. But that contrast shows us more than the progress of science. It reminds us sleep always reflects how we see the world. And in the darkness of the medieval night, dreams became the meeting place, where belief and fear touched and formed a second reality, one both sacred and haunting. January 1692. In a small village called Salem, deep in the cold of New England's winter, long nights draped themselves over wooden rooftops and barren fields. The hearth fire became the only center of warmth, where families gathered close, seeking shelter from the frost. Outside, the wind pushed through leafless forests, and the brittle limbs of trees scraped against wooden doors with strange, whispering sounds. In that air, cold and tense, the villagers fought not only the chill, but something harder to grasp, a fear of the unseen, of devils, of shadows said to stalk the soul. Salem was no great city, just a remote colonial village, but in the winter of that year, it would become the center of one of the most infamous panics in Western history. It began inside the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's strict and severe minister, a man who believed his role was to guard the souls of his flock from every whisper of evil. His daughter Betty, just 9, and his niece Abigail, 11, often sat by the fire with the women of the household. On cold nights, they shared stories, played little games of fortune-telling, whispered of things mysterious. In the harsh Puritan world, where even loud laughter was frowned upon, these quiet amusements became small escapes. But from that quiet came something else, something no one expected. Betty and Abigail began to change. Witnesses would later say the girls convulsed, bodies twisting, voices crying out in strange tongues. They shrieked, then fell silent, eyes wide, as if staring at something only they could see in the dark. Their small frames trembled, collapsed, then suddenly sprang upright as if chased by something unseen. Today we might look to medicine, epilepsy, poisoning, a nervous disorder. But in the 17th century there was only one answer. The devil was at work. Whispers spread quickly through the village. From hearth to hearth, the question was not, why are the girls sick, but who did this to them? In Puritan belief, the devil could not possess a godly child, not unless someone, some witch, had called him in. And so the image of the witch, hidden, deceptive, among them began to take root. This fear didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew from the hard soil of Puritan life. In Salem, the world was split in two. On one side, God and his chosen. On the other, the devil and those who served him. Life itself was fragile, failed harvests, plague, wars with native peoples. Every misfortune could be read as a sign of evil's presence. So when girls screamed in the night and shook on the floor, no one needed further proof. The devil had entered the village. Picture a night in Salem. The house is dark. A candle flickers against the pale face of Betty, who jerks up from the bed with a piercing cry. Beside her, Abigail trembles the same way. The women of the house gather and pray, but their prayers do nothing. The girls do not calm. At last, they say the thing no one wants to say. This is not illness. Ministers are summoned to read scripture aloud. They kneel at the bedside, voices steady, but instead of peace, the air tightens. The girls lash out even more violently, as if the words of God were clashing with something inside them. And Salem begins to shift. Conversations become whispers. Neighbors are watched with new suspicion. Someone did this. There must be a witch, living among the faithful, pretending to pray, but whispering to the devil by night. Fear becomes search, and it all begins here, in Reverend Parris's home, with two young girls writhing on the floor. Looking back, it's not hard to see how the story caught fire. The Puritans lived with constant fear of hunger, of illness, of war, of being cast out by God. They believed salvation was reserved for a chosen few. Each day was a question. Have I believed enough? Have I been chosen or condemned? In that fragile state of mind, it took only a spark. And soon, it wasn't just Betty and Abigail. More girls in the village began to show the same signs. They fell to the ground, screamed, mumbled incoherently. The fits seemed to spread, like an invisible sickness. And the village began to panic. Someone had opened the door to the devil. From today's distance, we can guess at other explanations. Some suggest ergot poisoning, a fungus on rye that can cause hallucinations and seizures. Others think it was mass hysteria, a kind of unconscious imitation, or perhaps a simple mix of fear, trauma, and mental strain. But in Salem, in 1692, no one spoke of medicine. There was only one cause, witchcraft, and so the small fits in one wooden house became the seed of a nightmare. What started as a private mystery erupted into a public crisis, trials, executions, and a stain that would mark American memory for centuries. But in that beginning moment, no one knew where it would lead. They only knew that the devil had stolen the sleep of their children, and with it, the fragile peace of the village was gone. In the weeks after Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began to convulse, the whispers in Salem village only grew louder. The twisting limbs, the screams, the strange behaviors of the girls were no longer seen as illness. They were proof. Proof that the devil was here. And the question everyone asked, in low voices and behind closed doors, was no longer if there were witches, but who among them was the witch? The first name spoken aloud, as accusation, as warning, was Sarah Good. Sarah Good was a poor woman, nearly an outcast. Her husband owned no land, and they often wandered from house to house, seeking shelter. Villagers were used to seeing her on the roads, tattered clothes, muttering to herself. Children avoided her. Adults saw her as a bad omen. In the depths of winter, she knocked on doors, begging for food. And when she was turned away, she muttered curses under her breath. In Puritan Salem, where words were believed to carry spiritual weight, a ragged woman speaking strange words wasn't just pitiful. She was dangerous. So when the girls cried out that they saw Sarah Good's shadow in their visions, many believed it without hesitation. The second name was Sarah Osborne. She wasn't destitute, but she had her own stain in the eyes of the community. She had been ill for a long time and had stopped attending church, a sign of spiritual weakness. Worse still, she had remarried and become entangled in land disputes with her former husband's children. To a society that demanded female obedience, her choices marked her as greedy, rebellious, and suspect. And so, when the afflicted girls said her spirit had visited them at night, the village listened. The third woman accused was Tituba, a Caribbean slave living in the very house of Reverend Paris. To the Puritans, Tituba came from an alien world. Her skin was different, her voice, her stories, different. On long evenings, she sometimes told folk tales, stories that may have included devils, spirits, spells. The children listened with wide eyes. And so, when the fits began, Tituba became the perfect villain. The girls claimed they saw her whispering to the devil, leading dark animals, forcing them to sign their names in Satan's book. 3 women, 3 lives that had little in common, except for this: they all lived on the edges of Puritan society. A homeless beggar, a sick woman who defied gender norms, an enslaved outsider. In a world that prized sameness and submission, they were easy targets for collective fear. The first hearings began in early March of 1692. The setting was plain, but the mood was charged, as though the room itself were no longer a courtroom, but a ritual space. The same girls who had once convulsed in the Paris household were now on display before the public. When Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, or Tituba entered, the girls screamed, collapsed, clutched their bodies as if in pain. To the villagers, this was not theatre, this was evidence. Sarah Good cried out her innocence. She said she knew nothing of the devil. But who listened to the pleas of a ragged woman? Sarah Osborne, frail and barely able to stand, also denied everything. But her weakness, her pale, trembling body, only made it easier to believe her soul belonged to Satan. Tituba was different. Pressed hard by questions, perhaps threatened, perhaps beaten, she confessed. But her confession was not simple. She didn't just nod, she spoke in detail. About being forced by the devil, about a book filled with the names of other witches, about spirits and dark animals. And in doing so, she lit the match that turned panic into wildfire. If there were dozens of witches, then Salem was no longer just a village. It was a battlefield between God and Satan. To the Puritans, Tituba's confession did not end the fear. It widened it. If witches were everywhere, then anyone could be guilty. A neighbor, a friend, a family member. The village, once tightly knit, was now tangled in suspicion. Picture the scene. Sarah Good, standing in the flickering light of the courtroom, her thin face lit by candle flame, shouting that she was innocent. But the cries and convulsions of the girls drowned her out. Sarah Osborne, barely upright, whispering explanations no one wanted to hear. And Tituba, voice trembling, describing midnight visits from the devil as the room fell silent, chilled. In that space, reason had been left at the door. All that remained was fear, and the unshakable belief that Satan had come to Salem. These first interrogations laid the foundation for everything that followed. The 3 women became more than accused. They became symbols of poverty, of sickness, of difference, and all of it was now suspect. From this moment, the list of the accused would only grow longer. The village and everyone in it was caught in a storm they did not know how to stop. When the Salem trials began, what made them unusual wasn't the presence of the accused or the malice in the accusations, but the kind of evidence that was accepted. They called it spectral evidence. Under normal law, evidence needed to be physical: a knife, a clear confession, an eyewitness who saw the act. But in Salem, in the year 1692, that standard was turned upside down. Instead of the tangible, the court accepted the unseen, things no one could witness except the accuser. During the trials, the girls, the central figures in the whole hysteria, would often rise, trembling, eyes wide, and collapse to the floor. They screamed that they could see the soul of the accused, also known as a spectre. appearing before them, clawing at them, whispering devilish words. A man or woman could be standing calmly in the room, and yet the girls would cry that their spirit was the one causing harm, and the court accepted it. Picture a small, crowded room, candlelight casting flickering shadows on tense faces. As a defendant steps in, several girls immediately fall to the ground, as if invisible hands were choking them. They wail, insisting they see the accused's ghostly image standing behind them, even while that person stands directly in front of them. For the Puritans, who believed deeply that the devil could manipulate both the visible and invisible worlds, this wasn't absurd. If Satan had borrowed someone's soul as a weapon, then their body might be here, but their spectre could still harm from elsewhere. What made this kind of evidence terrifying was that it couldn't be disproven. If someone was accused and denied it, the denial held no weight because the evidence wasn't based on real actions, but on someone else's word about what only they could see. If Betty, Abigail, or Ann Putnam screamed that they saw Sarah Good's spirit choking them, Sarah Good could cry her innocence. But who would believe a poor woman over a child supposedly tormented by evil? The trials became haunting performances. When the judge questioned the girls, they described what they saw in vivid detail. She's standing there in black beside a big dog, and she's laughing at us. The crowd shivered. They saw nothing. But the sincerity of the children's convulsions made everyone believe that something invisible must be there. And in a Puritan community, there was no invisible power other than Satan. Spectral evidence wasn't invented in Salem. In Europe's long tradition, from witch trials in Germany and Switzerland to those in England, this form of proof had been accepted before. But Salem took it to an extreme. In a short span, dozens, then hundreds, were imprisoned simply because a small group claimed to see their ghosts causing harm. The vagueness of spectral evidence opened the door to every personal grudge. If someone hated their neighbor, they could coach a child or speak up themselves and say they saw the neighbor's ghost at night. No object needed, no proof, just words and a community steeped in shared fear. Any difference in the village, from land disputes to family rivalries, could be twisted into a charge of witchcraft. Inside the courtroom, belief wasn't just built on words, but on bodies. When a girl screamed that the accused spirit was hurting her, her entire frame would tremble, limbs contort, eyes roll. The Puritans believed in the truth of the body. If a body suffered, something must be causing it. And an unseen cause? That was even more terrifying. The darkness of the courtroom fed into the darkness of imagination, turning everything into truth. A strange aspect was that even the accused sometimes grew uncertain. Hearing people insist they saw their spectre doing harm, some began to doubt themselves. In such a harsh religious world, they wondered, if Satan truly could use my soul without my knowing it, then maybe I really did cause harm. The line between innocence and guilt blurred, even in the mind of the accused. Each night, villagers whispered among themselves. They spoke of strange lights in the fields, footsteps in the wind. Every story added to the shared fear, strengthening spectral evidence further. And each trial became a stage where the invisible was declared absolutely real. In a way, spectral evidence turned the law into a tool of imagination. It gave the unseen the greatest power. In Salem, truth didn't lie in physical proof. It lay in trembling, in screams, in the declarations of a few young witnesses. And that's what dragged the entire community into a spiral. The more accusations, the more convulsions. And the more people believed the devil truly walked among them. Looking back, many wonder, how could any court accept something so vague? But to the Puritans, in a time when religious belief shaped every part of life, the supernatural wasn't separate from reality. Souls, demons, miracles, they were all real. The only difference was not everyone could see them. And if certain girls had been chosen by God to sense evil, then their words became the highest evidence. In the suffocating courtroom, candlelight flickering, the scent of wood smoke curling through the air, the murmurs of the crowd compressed into silence. One person stood accused, not of actions, but of their soul harming a neighbor. They tried to deny it. No one listened. Every eye was fixed on the girls screaming on the floor. In that moment, truth had shifted. Not into what was seen or heard, but into what trembling hearts believed. And that belief is what plunged all of Salem into a nightmare that lasted through the year 1692. As the Salem trials continued, the fever of accusations spread like a fire through dry forest. At first, only a few names were spoken, but the number grew. Those who once stood at the edge, quietly watching, whispering, suddenly found themselves pulled into the center of suspicion. Anyone different, anyone at odds with a neighbor, anyone too poor or too strange, could become a target. The small village in Massachusetts slowly became an open-air prison. People whispered of lists of those to be watched, of strange looks in the dark, of unusual behavior. And those lists became indictments. Day by day, people were led from their homes, hands bound, and marched to jail. Old wooden doors shut behind them, and inside, dozens, then hundreds, were crammed together. What made Salem unique was how far the fear reached. In just a few months, more than 150 people were jailed, an enormous number for a village of only a few thousand. A jail meant for petty thieves now overflowed. The old, pregnant women, children, all imprisoned on the strength of vague accusations. The air inside was damp, the smell of rotting straw, unwashed bodies, and the clink of iron chains became the background to long, uncertain days. Once the trials turned to verdicts, punishment was no longer just a warning. Death became common. Public executions turned into community events where villagers came to watch, a kind of dark ritual. The gallows were raised, ropes twisted, and trembling bodies were placed on wooden platforms. People believed that through this they were purifying the village of the devil's presence. The first names to be hanged, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, became symbols of a tragic truth. Innocence could not save anyone once collective belief had turned away. Rebecca Nurse, an old, gentle woman known for her kindness, was still branded a witch. When she was hanged, many trembled, but no one dared protest. To protest was to invite accusation. One of the most haunting punishments was the case of Giles Corey. He was over 80. He refused to plead guilty or not guilty. Under Puritan law, if someone refused to enter a plea, the court could not officially try them or seize their property. Giles Corey knew that if he stayed silent, his land could still pass to his family. And so he said nothing. In response, the court sentenced him to pressing, an old form of torture. Corey was laid flat on the ground, heavy wooden boards placed on his chest, and large stones stacked one by one. Each time the judge asked if he would plead, he gave the same answer: more weight. And so another stone, and another, until his body could no longer bear it. He died after 3 days, becoming one of the period's most painful witnesses. The trials came relentlessly. Week after week, more were hanged. The crowd watched, afraid but relieved. Because as long as someone else was being accused, attention wasn't on them, but the relief was brief. No one knew if tomorrow their own name would be called. The entire community was trapped in a spiral of fear and silence. Meanwhile, those imprisoned waited, Some broke. They confessed out of desperation, hoping that confession might spare their lives. But to confess also meant accusing others. The court often required those who admitted guilt to name accomplices. And so the list grew. These confessions were not meant to reveal truth. They were meant to widen the net. The more who confessed, the more names were added. The panic spread so far that nearly every family in Salem was touched, either directly or indirectly. Executions took place on Gallows Hill, a low rise near the village. People climbed the dirt slope in groups, standing in the cold wind. As the rope tightened around each neck, a heavy silence settled. Then whispers returned. Perhaps Salem was now a little safer. The belief that these deaths were necessary made it easier for many to watch without protest. What haunted most was the presence of children in the crowd. Many of the same girls who had testified in court now stood present at the gallows. They watched adults led to the noose and went home with those images etched into memory. An entire generation grew up with the idea that justice could be carried out through destruction, that their own fear could decide someone else's fate. In time, Salem became a symbol of collective hysteria. More than 20 people executed, hundreds jailed, and a weight hung over everything. The church, once a place of faith, became a stage for accusation. The court, meant to seek justice, built its foundation on ambiguity. Looking back, it's hard to tell where belief ended and fear began. The trials, the deaths, the confessions. It was like a dark dream shared by the whole village. They were victims, and they were accomplices. The ropes on Gallows Hill didn't just hang bodies, they suspended a question in the air. How could fear turn a small village into a place where justice was turned upside down? After nearly a year, submerged in the shadow of accusation and death, the fire in Salem began to fade on its own. Not because the people suddenly awoke, but because the weight of the verdicts became too heavy, too visible to hide behind the veil of belief. As the number of arrests rose, even respected families, those with standing in the community, began to find themselves named. The hysteria was no longer a burden carried by the powerless. It had started to knock on the doors of the powerful. And when the leadership grew uneasy, the machinery of accusation began to stall. The ministers and judges, once eager to lead, now hesitated. Many of them realized that spectral evidence, those vague claims of ghosts and shadows in dreams, could no longer justify the deaths of dozens. In a society built on scripture and law, executing people based on phantoms was becoming dangerous, even to those who once believed in it. The trials grew chaotic. Accusers contradicted one another. The testimonies of the girls were no longer consistent. Some of the accused were known in the community as upstanding, even admirable, and calling them witches began to sow doubt. Slowly, absolute belief began to tremble. And when the political powers of Massachusetts feared that disorder might spiral beyond control, the decision was made: the Salem witch court would end. By the end of 1692, the court of Oyer and Terminer, the body that had overseen the witch trials, was dissolved. A new court was formed, one that no longer accepted spectral evidence. Those still imprisoned were released. Many death sentences were overturned, but with more than 20 lives already lost to the gallows and hundreds more who had languished in jail, this was no salvation, only a late and hollow ending. What followed were long years of silence and regret. The families of the victims carried their pain quietly. In a Puritan society, apologies were not easily spoken. Decades would pass before the Massachusetts government issued any formal statement of remorse or symbolic compensation. In 1711, a law was passed to restore the names and property of some of the condemned. But for those who had died on Gallows Hill, these apologies were slow echoes. Too late to undo the past. Still, the memory of Salem did not disappear. It lingered as a collective scar, a reminder that justice can be twisted when fear becomes the judge. Passed down through generations, the story of Salem became a symbol, a warning, woven into books and cultural memory. People began to call it a moral panic, a state in which belief and hysteria distort reason. And when we place Salem alongside other moments of mass fear in history, the similarities become clear. In Europe, from the 15th to the 17th century, witch hunts claimed tens of thousands of lives, most of them women. Small villages in Germany, Switzerland, and France once built pyres to burn those believed to have made pacts with the devil. In comparison, Salem was only a small dot, but that dot reflects the entire illness of humanity. Fear and blind belief can turn any community into an executioner of its own. Look further still, and Salem echoes the Inquisition in Spain, where heretics were tortured and burned for opposing Catholic doctrine. The settings and faiths were different, but the driving force was the same, a collective belief that order must be preserved by purging the different. And in that process, justice became a tool to enforce power, not to protect people. Looking back, it's clear, Salem was not an isolated moment. These things don't vanish. They change form. In the 20th century, many societies faced new waves of moral panic. Fear of communism during McCarthyism, satanic cult hysteria in the 1980s, or outbreaks of misinformation that left entire communities in confusion. They all share the same pattern. People quickly find someone to blame, and suspicion spreads faster than truth. If Salem was a collective nightmare, the lesson it leaves behind still holds. Human beings, in every century, carry the capacity to fear and the instinct to follow the crowd. The girls in Salem once pointed at their neighbors, and centuries later, people still point fingers at the others among them. The devil may change names into an ideology, an immigrant group, or a social movement, but the pattern repeats. The fall of the Salem court was more than the end of a trial. It was a mirror. It reflected how easily a small, tightly woven community can be consumed by blind belief, and how that same community, through exhaustion and regret, can slowly claw its way back to reason. But the cost is always human life, a cost that cannot be reclaimed. And so, as we close the story of Salem, we don't just hear the creak of the noose on Gallows Hill. We hear echoes again of the witch hunts in Europe, of the judgments of the Inquisition, and of the panics of our modern age, all part of a sorrowful refrain that when fear leads, we are always willing to sacrifice reason for the illusion of safety. Among the names most often mentioned in the final days of the Roman Republic, it's easy to recall Caesar, Pompey, or Antony. But if we listen more closely, hidden between the lines of history is a woman whose fate was no less fierce. She left behind no marble-carved victories, but her mark is etched deep into the political storms of Rome. Her name was Fulvia. Fulvia was born into a noble family from Tusculum, a small town in Latium. Her house did not belong to the highest ranks of Roman power, but it held enough prestige to marry a daughter into political ambition. In Rome, women were rarely seen as political actors. They appeared in historical records mainly as mothers, wives, or instruments of diplomacy through marriage. But from a young age, Fulvia entered that stage in an unusual way. She was not just the wife of politicians, she became part of their ambition. Fulvia's first husband was Publius Clodius Pulcher, a notorious figure in Roman history. Clodius was far from a model statesman. He was famous for being bold, sometimes reckless, and often scandalous. One of the most infamous stories about him was the time he disguised himself as a woman to sneak into the Bona Dea festival, a religious ceremony strictly reserved for women, held in the home of Caesar, who was then the Pontifex Maximus. The incident caused an uproar, offending religious customs and sparking legal and political uproar. Thanks to his oratory skill and support from the populist faction, Clodius escaped punishment, but his name became a subject of constant gossip in Rome. When Fulvia married Clodius, she stepped into a whirlwind, a world where politics, violence, and populism intertwined. Clodius was a tribune of the plebs, a representative of the common people, but his power didn't come from words alone. He built a street gang, using violence to threaten rivals and protect his influence. Romans were already accustomed to political violence, but Clodius turned it into an art form. Fulvia did not stand aside. Roman sources, often harsh toward politically involved women, describe her as fiercely devoted to her husband's cause. One account claims she accompanied Clodius during his rallies, appearing among the crowds, something most noble women of the time would never do. It made her both visible and, to conservative Romans, deeply unsettling. In 52 BCE, Fulvia's life took a tragic turn. Clodius was killed by his rival Milo in a violent encounter on the Appian Way, the famous road leading into Rome. Clodius's death was not only a private loss for Fulvia, it became an immediate political crisis. His body was brought back to the city, and the funeral turned into a riot. Crowds of Clodius's supporters, numbering in the thousands, gathered to mourn him. Weeping, enraged, they carried his body into the Roman Forum itself, where the echoes of orators and Senate debates still hung in the air. The funeral pyre, instead of being lit in a cemetery, was set alight inside the Curia Hostilia, the Senate house. The entire building burned down, and Clodius's death lit the fuse for the chaos that followed. In that moment, Fulvia appeared not merely as a grieving widow, but as a symbol. She stood beside her husband's body, showing his wounds to the people, stoking their anger. Roman historians recorded how she presented Clodius's corpse to the public, turning private grief into collective fury. For a woman of her time, appearing in the midst of a riot was unheard of. But Fulvia did it, and that image carved itself into Rome's political memory. The funeral of Clodius marked Fulvia's first entry into history as a political agent, not through speeches, not through official power, but through presence and the ability to stir the emotions of a crowd. The historians, often hostile to women in politics, painted her as manipulative, but that very bias shows us how real her influence was. From there, Fulvia did not retreat into the shadows, as many widows might. She remained on the stage. Her later marriages would pull her even deeper into the center of Rome's storms. But before Antony, before the civil wars, Fulvia had already inscribed her name in history. Through the death of Clodius and the riotous funeral where a woman turned personal tragedy into political leverage. After the death of Clodius, Fulvia found herself in a position both perilous and full of possibility. In late 1st century BCE Rome, aristocratic marriages were never just matters of personal affection. They were political links in a chain. A young widow, wealthy, and tied to a well-known populist figure naturally became a prize many factions sought to claim. Fulvia knew this well, and she didn't stand outside the game. She turned it into her path deeper into power. Her second husband was Gaius Scribonius Curio, another man caught in the current of Roman politics. Curio came from a noble family and had initially aligned with the conservative faction, opposing Julius Caesar. But later, through both political calculation and the persuasion of money, he became one of Caesar's fiercest supporters during the rising divide between Caesar and Pompey. His marriage to Fulvia brought him into contact with the same crowds that had once rallied around Clodius. It strengthened his popularity. But the marriage would not last long. Curio soon joined the civil war. In 49 BCE, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and began his march against Pompey, Curio became one of his generals. He was sent to Africa to fight Pompey's forces, and there, at Utica, he was killed in battle. Fulvia was widowed once more. But again, she did not vanish into the background. The death of Curio did not dim her presence, it enhanced it. She inherited not only his estate, but his political capital. And in a society where alliances were fragile and power constantly shifting, Fulvia remained a valuable piece on the board. Her third husband was Marcus Antonius, known to us as Mark Antony. This was the marriage that placed Fulvia at the very heart of Roman history. Antony was not only a trusted ally of Caesar. After Caesar's assassination, he became one of the three men who formed the Second Triumvirate, a coalition that ruled over Rome and decided the fate of the Republic. Fulvia and Antony may have met when his career was still young, but their bond deepened after Fulvia had already twice been a widow. Fulvia didn't just bring Antony access to the populist base and the lingering prestige of Clodius. She brought experience, deep, lived experience in the handling of crowds and the currents of power. And that was something Antony, with all his charisma and oratorical skill, deeply needed. It was during this time that Fulvia's strength became clearest. She was not simply the wife of a statesman, she was a partner directly involved in the machinery of politics. After Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Rome plunged into chaos. Antony, along with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate to oppose Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's assassins. In this volatile period, Fulvia played a crucial role in Rome, while Antony was often away with the army. Roman sources frequently note that she involved herself in political decisions, held sway with the troops, and even took part in distributing land to veterans, one of the triumvirate's key policies. Some accounts describe Fulvia appearing in public alongside Antony, or even representing him alone in his absence. In a society that saw women as second-class citizens, this made her an easy target for criticism. Classical historians, mostly elite Roman men, described her with harsh words, ambitious, ruthless, even manlike. But setting aside that bias reveals another picture, a woman using every tool she had, lineage, marriage, persuasion, to secure a place for herself and her family in a violent, uncertain age. Her marriage to Antony was not just political, it was intense, even personal. Antony was known for being passionate, generous, and prone to indulgence. Fulvia seemed to be more than a supporter. She sometimes held the reins. According to Cicero, Antony's political enemy, Fulvia was the one truly in charge, while Antony acted on impulse. Cicero meant it as an insult. But even through his mockery, one hears a grudging acknowledgement. Fulvia was no shadow. She was a force. Through 3 marriages, Fulvia moved steadily deeper into the heart of Roman power. With Clodius, she stepped into populism and street violence. With Curio, she connected to Caesar and the reformist faction. And with Antony, she stood at the edge of Rome's highest political order, where every decision could shake the Republic itself. Each time she became a widow, Fulvia returned stronger. She is one of the rare figures in Roman history, a woman who rose not in spite of her losses, but through them. In the broader canvas of history, Fulvia is often forgotten, or described with suspicion. Her role disrupted the feminine ideal that ancient historians expected. But if we follow the arc of her 3 marriages, a different thread emerges. Fulvia wasn't just attached to powerful men. She helped shape the roads they traveled. Without her, Clodius might not have sustained his popular movement. Curio might not have forged ties with the masses so easily. And Antony, in those critical early years of the triumvirate, might have lacked a political anchor. Fulvia was never meant to be a spectator, and she never was. When Julius Caesar fell beneath the blades of assassins on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, the city of Rome was plunged into a shock few could have fully imagined. Panic gripped the people. Political factions scrambled for position. Caesar's allies rushed to preserve their lives, while his enemies cloaked themselves in the mantle of liberators of the Republic. Into this chaos stepped Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally. He seized the moment of Caesar's funeral, turning grief into a political weapon. With impassioned words, he ignited the fury of the crowd and forced Caesar's killers into retreat. But even Antony, bold and eloquent as he was, could not be everywhere at once. He had armies to command, deals to negotiate, power to secure, as he forged the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus. And in the vacuum left behind in Rome, Fulvia stepped forward into a role few Roman women had ever occupied. She became the one who held the city's pulse. Fulvia did not retreat into the shadows. In Antony's absence, she emerged as his representative. Even ancient historians, often reluctant to acknowledge the political presence of women, had to admit that she governed Rome during the years 43 to 42 BCE. People came to her for land, for justice, for news. Soldiers returning from campaigns saw not Antony but Fulvia distributing rewards and land. In their eyes, she was not just his wife, she was an extension of his authority. One image often repeated is that of Fulvia appearing in public forums or at land distributions. She spoke little, but her presence was enough. For veterans who had once fought for Caesar, receiving land from Fulvia's hand meant Antony had kept his promise, even in his absence. That built loyalty, and it raised Fulvia's stature. Naturally, this made enemies. Historians from opposing camps wrote of her with mockery, calling her power-hungry, claiming she had overstepped the bounds of womanhood. Cicero, Antony's lifelong rival, once sneered that Fulvia ruled more than her husband. But read between the lines, and another truth emerges: her influence was real. Real enough that her enemies had to diminish it with words. Rome at the time was far from stable. The streets could erupt in violence. Senate factions still schemed. Fulvia had to hold order, protect Antony's interests, and keep the link between soldiers and government alive. She became the bridge between citizens and distant decisions made on campaign. It's not hard to imagine that without Fulvia, that space would have been filled by Antony's rivals, weakening his hold before he ever returned. It was during this period that stories, sometimes absurd, often malicious, began to attach themselves to her name. One tale claims she drove a hairpin into the tongue of Cicero's image as revenge for his insults. Whether true or not, it reflects how the Roman mind viewed her. A woman unafraid to hate, unafraid to act, even capable of embodying the violence usually reserved for men. In a society used to quiet wives in the background, Fulvia stood out too brightly to be described gently. When Antony and Octavian formed the second triumvirate, Fulvia remained a powerful figure in Rome. She managed what Antony left behind: homes, assets, alliances. Some historians suggest that she even pushed for harsh policies against Caesar's enemies, including the infamous proscriptions, which named individuals as outlaws and seized their property. The extent of her role is difficult to prove, but one thing is certain: she was not an onlooker. The obsession classical historians had with Fulvia reflects how unusual she was. In their eyes, she symbolized something wrong, a woman daring to take the political stage. But from another angle, Fulvia did what most Roman women could never do. She held power not as a hollow title, but through presence, through administration, through her influence over soldiers and citizens alike. The moment Caesar died, he left a hole in Rome's center. Fulvia was among the first to fill it. In Antony's absence, she became the anchor for the populists, for the troops, for those who still believed in Caesar's vision. If Antony was the blaze raging on the battlefield, then Fulvia was the steady flame keeping Rome from falling entirely into darkness. And whether the ancient historians chose to accept it or not, that was the truth. In the chaos that followed Caesar's death, Fulvia was the one who ruled Rome. As Octavian gradually solidified his power alongside Antony and Lepidus within the Second Triumvirate, the alliance began to crack. Antony was in the east, preoccupied with Egypt, Greece, and the wealthy provinces. Octavian remained in Italy, facing thousands of Caesar's veterans still waiting for the land they'd been promised. The issue of land distribution became the most volatile spark. Octavian had to seize land from Italian communities to settle the troops, and the towns, stripped of their fields, seethed with anger. They felt sacrificed for the ambition of a new regime. Into that tension, Fulvia stepped, like a strong wind, turning friction into flames. Fulvia was no longer merely Antony's wife. She had become the face of his faction in Rome. Watching Octavian grow in power, she feared that Antony would be sidelined. The historians Appian and Dio both write that Fulvia would not sit idly by while Antony lost ground. Together with Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother, she launched a direct challenge. Lucius had political clout. Fulvia had influence among the people and the army. Together they channeled the frustration of dispossessed Italians into a banner of resistance against Octavian. The immediate cause of the war was land. Italian farmers were being stripped of their holdings to make room for veterans. Their resentment grew, and Fulvia seized it. She accused Octavian of acting purely out of self-interest, declaring that Antony alone remained true to Caesar's ideals. In doing so, she transformed an economic grievance into a political struggle. Her rallying cry spread across central Italy, from Etruria to Umbria, and culminated in the city of Perusia, where the opposition gathered its strength. Fulvia did not take to the battlefield on horseback, but she was present in the rear, urging, directing, and in the eyes of many, embodying the spirit of the war. Some sources even claim she participated in military councils with Lucius, planning the resistance. Whether exaggerated or not, the fact that Romans associated her so directly with the conflict speaks volumes. The Perusine War erupted in 41 BCE. Lucius Antonius and his allies seized control of several towns across central Italy, while Octavian marshaled his forces and laid siege. The war was not a campaign of grand field battles, but of encirclement and attrition. Perugia became the focal point, where Lucius held out. Winter closed in, supplies dwindled, the people starved. Fulvia remained in Rome, seeking allies. She appealed to other generals, hoping they would support Antony. But Antony was far away, unable to intervene, and many commanders hesitated, unwilling to plunge into another civil war. Octavian, on the other hand, was resolute. He understood that if Fulvia and Lucius succeeded, his position would crumble. So the siege of Perusia tightened with each passing day. In early 40 BCE, Perusia fell. Lucius Antonius was forced to surrender. Octavian, playing the part of the magnanimous victor, spared Lucius's life. But many of his supporters were executed, and the people of Perusia faced brutal retribution. Archaeological traces of scorched layers suggest that part of the city was burned, a physical scar left by Octavian's wrath. For Fulvia, the defeat was a turning point. She was blamed for inciting the war, accused of weakening Antony's position. Ancient historians painted her as a woman consumed by ambition, or, more dismissively, by jealousy over Antony's involvement with Cleopatra. This framing reduced her political choices to personal emotions. But beneath those accounts lies another truth. Fulvia had acted to preserve Antony's standing in the face of Octavian's rise. It was a dangerous game of power, and she lost. After the fall of Perusia, Fulvia had to leave Italy. She sailed to Greece, where Antony was stationed. Their reunion was not peaceful. Antony, furious, believed that her actions had sparked a war in his absence, drained his support in Italy, and handed Octavian the upper hand. But from another angle, Fulvia had not acted without cause. She saw her husband's legacy under threat. She saw her family's power slipping. And she chose the only path she knew: to fight. The Perusian War stands as the clearest proof of Fulvia's direct engagement in Roman politics and war. No longer just a woman handing out money to soldiers or standing in the forum as a proxy, she had become a co-leader in an armed conflict. Even in defeat, this carved her name into Roman memory as a woman who dared what few had. In the traditional telling of the Perusian War, the conflict is framed as one between Lucius Antonius and Octavian. But Fulvia's shadow lingers in every corner of the story. Even sources hostile to her couldn't deny her presence. And it is striking, in a culture that denied women a place in politics, that one woman could ignite an entire civil war. Though she lost, Fulvia did what few dared. She turned disadvantage into opportunity and inscribed herself onto the battlefield of power. When Perusia fell, it wasn't just a city that collapsed. It was the dream of Antony's control over Italy. Octavian, once the young junior ally, emerged as the dominant force on the peninsula. In her effort to protect her husband's legacy, Fulvia had, unintentionally, helped usher in the rise of his greatest rival. But even in defeat, her image endures, a woman who refused to step back, who lit the match rather than surrender power. When Fulvia left Italy for Greece, it was not a voluntary journey. It was a quiet exile, a retreat after the bitter defeat at Perusia. The woman who had once shaken Rome now stepped onto a departing ship, carrying with her a stained reputation, the weight of cruel rumors, and a heart still burning with ambition. Greece, where Antony was stationed, was her destination. But it was also the final chapter of her life. Historians tell us that when she reunited with Antony, she was no longer a welcomed wife. Antony was furious. He saw her as the direct cause of his faction's collapse, the reason Octavian had seized Italy. The image of a brave wife who had carried the burden of politics in her husband's absence was turned upside down. Now she was seen as reckless, the one who had ruined everything. History, often cold, dealt Fulvia its chill, not through enemies, but through the one closest to her. In Greece, Fulvia declined quickly. Some sources say she fell ill, physically exhausted, emotionally drained. Others suggest she died of sorrow, of disappointment. In 40 BCE, Fulvia died in Sicyon, a city far from Rome. No triumphal arches, no state funeral. The woman who had once thrown an empire into civil war died in a foreign land. Her death marked a turning point for Antony. With Fulvia gone, he and Octavian swiftly reconciled. A political marriage was arranged. Antony would marry Octavia, Octavian's sister. The alliance was restored, and Fulvia, with her fiery presence and inconvenient power, was no longer in the way. She died, and in many eyes her death became the condition for two men to make peace. Perhaps in the logic of that moment, it was her final role in history. an obstacle to be removed. But if we end her story there, we see only a Fulvia who lost. The truth is far more complex. Roman authors described Fulvia with bitter words: arrogant, jealous, ruthless, overreaching. Appian, Dio, Plutarch all painted her as a mistake, a danger. This image echoed through centuries, reducing her to a shadow beside Antony and Caesar. But read more closely, and an injustice emerges. The same actions, if taken by a man, would be called political genius. Done by a woman, they became insolence. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to have her portrait stamped onto a coin. That coin, bearing her likeness, was no accident. It was proof of her real influence. She had power enough that the currency of the state bore her face. And yet this detail is often omitted from the stories. It's more convenient to retell tales of jealousy than to admit to symbols of political authority. Compared to Cleopatra, the contrast sharpens. Cleopatra, another woman on the political stage, is remembered as an intelligent, seductive queen, even if wrapped in bias. Agrippina, Nero's mother, manipulated Roman politics and is still acknowledged as a political figure. Joan of Arc, centuries later, was burned as a witch, then canonized as a saint. And Fulvia? She is largely forgotten or mentioned only as a bitter anecdote. What they share is simple. They all entered a realm reserved for men, but how they are remembered differs. Cleopatra became an icon of seduction, Agrippina of cunning, Joan of divine martyrdom. Fulvia, meanwhile, was buried under dust as if Rome wished to erase the memory of a woman who dared to challenge order. The truth is, if Fulvia had been a man, her story would sound different. A man who started the Perusian War to defend his faction would be praised for loyalty and courage. A man with his face on a coin would be remembered as a symbol of state power. A man who turned a funeral into political revolt would be called a brilliant orator. But Fulvia was a woman, so her actions were cast as reckless, dangerous, emotional. Her death in Greece wasn't just the end of a person, it was the end of a possibility, the chance that Rome might acknowledge a woman's place in politics. That door, briefly open, slammed shut again. History chose to forget. The storytellers chose to distort. And for centuries, Fulvia was remembered not as inspiration, but as warning. But if we remember her now, in this moment, beneath the steady rhythm of a voice meant for sleep, Fulvia lives again. She is no longer just Antony's wife or a name attached to a lost war. She becomes a symbol of courage that didn't fit its time. And perhaps, somewhere, that is more enduring than any victory. America in the 1960s was a landscape both familiar and distant, orderly yet chaotic. If you picture America in that era, what likely comes to mind are the gleaming cars, the diners serving hamburgers and milkshakes, the model families in tidy suburbs with white picket fences. That was the advertised face, the face of the American dream after World War II. But just beneath the glossy paint lay another reality, tight, uneasy, a world where skin color still held the master key, determining where you could live, what school you could attend, where you could sit on a bus, even whether you had the right to vote. In many southern states, the Jim Crow laws remained fully intact. Signs hung in plain sight, whites only, colored entrance. A public water fountain labeled for whites stood next to a rusted, grimy one for black Americans. Buses divided their seats, whites in front, blacks in the back. And if a white passenger boarded and found no seat, a black passenger had to give theirs up, even if exhausted after a long day's work. Schools, hospitals, parks, even cemeteries were all divided. Imagine a black child growing up in that world, walking past a bright, spacious schoolyard, only to return to a cramped classroom with worn-out desks. Seeing their parents pay taxes like everyone else, but unable to vote. Knowing that just one wrong glance, one careless word, could lead to a beating, or worse. That fear wasn't exaggerated, it was daily reality. In the South, the Ku Klux Klan was still active. White robes, pointed hoods, burning crosses in front of black homes. They beat and even killed with no fear of justice. Local authorities, police, courts, many simply looked away. Worse, some were complicit. A murdered black man might never see his case reach trial, but a black person, falsely accused, even without proof, could be lynched, and no one would intervene. From that soil, the civil rights movement began to grow. It didn't start with fiery speeches, but with small, brave acts. A young woman named Rosa Parks in 1955 refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. That action, just sitting still, rang like a bell. Thousands of black Americans boycotted the buses for over a year. They walked to work, they carpooled. That quiet endurance forced the Supreme Court to declare bus segregation unconstitutional. But legal victories on paper did not mean change in everyday life. In many places, white resistance only hardened. When a group of black students tried to enroll at Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, they were met by angry mobs and the National Guard. President Eisenhower had to send federal troops to escort the children who only wanted to learn. In the early 1960s, sit-ins at diners and cross-state freedom rides began to multiply. Young people, many still students, stepped into danger to challenge Jim Crow's laws. They were beaten, arrested, but they kept going. Television brought those images into living rooms across America, forcing white families to see that things were not, in fact, just fine. Meanwhile, in the North, things looked different, but remained unjust. There were no segregation signs. But black families still had to live in separate neighborhoods, take the hardest jobs for the lowest wages. Doors to opportunity were closed. Banks denied loans, landlords denied leases, employers denied jobs. The American dream, with its suburban homes and white picket fences, still existed, but only for some. And yet, in the midst of injustice, hope also stirred. Martin Luther King Jr., a young pastor from the South, began to emerge as a leader. His voice, calm and even, never shouted, but reached deep into the pain of his people. He insisted that only nonviolent struggle could lead to true reconciliation. His sermons echoed Gandhi in India, and many began to believe that perhaps a dream of justice could still become real. But the tension only grew sharper. On one side, President John F. Kennedy began to speak publicly in favor of civil rights, calling it a moral issue. On the other, Southern governors openly resisted, vowing to preserve the white way of life. In 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, police used attack dogs and fire hoses on black children marching in protest. Those images were broadcast nationwide, shocking the world and forcing America to look in the mirror. In that reality, each night's sleep for a black family was restless, not just from poverty, but from constant fear. Would someone be arrested tomorrow without cause? Would a house be burned? Would a knock at the door bring disaster? That sleep, if compared to the segmented sleep of the Middle Ages, differed in one crucial way. It was not a product of biology. It was a condition of society, half rest, half watchfulness. America in the 1960s was a land of tension and of hope, a giant chessboard where forces moved against each other, federal power versus state defiance, civil rights versus conservatism, progress versus control. Everyone knew a moment of reckoning was drawing near, a moment when scattered voices would need a single event to become a chorus. And in that moment, the idea of a great march on Washington began to take shape. When people remember the 1963 March on Washington, the image that often comes to mind is of Martin Luther King standing before the Lincoln Memorial, his voice ringing through the thick August heat, the words, "I have a dream," carving their place into history. But great events do not simply materialize. A day when hundreds of thousands descend on the Capitol, moving in order, eating, listening, chanting, cannot be the product of sudden inspiration. Behind that dream were patient hands, visionaries drawing up blueprints for something vast. And in this case, two names stood out, a Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Philip Randolph was already in the later years of life when the march was conceived. A long-standing figure in the Black Labor movement, he was known since the 1940s for pressuring President Roosevelt to ban racial discrimination in the defense industry. Randolph was not loud. Tall, lean, with a calm presence and always neatly dressed in dark suits. People said when he entered a room, he didn't need many words. He carried quiet authority. He believed in the power of collective unity. He believed that mass marches could shake the foundations of injustice. Beside him stood Bayard Rustin, younger, more fiery, and far more controversial. Rustin was a brilliant organizer, deeply experienced in non-violent movements. He had studied directly under Gandhi's teachings and brought those principles into American activism. He knew how to arrange everything, how many buses to book, who would hold the microphones, how to coordinate with the police. But Rustin was also a complicated figure. He was openly gay at a time when society was harsh and unforgiving, a fact that made some leaders uneasy. Still, no one could deny, without Rustin, the march would not have unfolded so seamlessly. Picture the planning meetings in a small New York office in the months leading up to the event. A map of the United States lies on the table, lines drawn from every corner, pointing toward Washington. They had to calculate everything, how to get 250,000 people there on time, how to feed them, where they would go to the bathroom, how to set up a sound system loud enough for the furthest listener to hear. This wasn't just a protest, it was the building of a temporary city for a single day. Rustin called it the logistics of a dream. Randolph and Rustin divided the work like a symphony. Randolph, the conductor, the visionary, ensuring unity in message and politics. He faced the public, the press, projecting a steady image that reassured both the White House and labor unions. Rustin worked behind the curtain, arranging every detail. He understood that one small misstep, too few restrooms, too much traffic, could be twisted by the media and used to discredit the message. So he planned it all, volunteer medics, water bottles, even making sure the speeches weren't too long. The striking thing was how their differences made them stronger. Randolph brought gravity and political clout. Rustin brought boldness and precision. If Randolph was the lead architect sketching the vision, Rustin was the field engineer making it real. And they both knew a dream needs more than hope. It needs detail. Throughout the preparation, they faced doubt. Many feared the march would spiral into chaos, that 250,000 people gathering could lead to violence. The Kennedy administration was nervous. The president and his advisors worried that scenes of unrest would ruin the push for civil rights legislation. So Randolph and Rustin promised absolute peace. Rustin held training sessions, teaching participants how to stay calm when provoked, repeating again and again, "Do not meet violence with violence." On some level, they were also building trust. They had to bring together dozens of different groups, labor unions, church associations, student movements. Each had its own goals, its own style, but Randolph offered a unifying message. This was not just a march for Black Americans, but a march for economic and social justice for all. That broad vision helped the march transcend any one community. It became a national moment. Personal differences surfaced too. Some black leaders were uncomfortable with Rustin's role, uncomfortable with his sexuality, and his past arrest for same-sex relations. They feared his presence would be weaponized by political opponents. It was Randolph who stepped in to defend him, declaring that Rustin's skill mattered more than any prejudice. That gesture didn't just protect Rustin, it sent a message of loyalty and trust. Imagine the scale: hundreds of buses from the south, special trains from the north, thousands of flyers printed and distributed, hundreds of volunteers lining the National Mall to guide the crowd. As the day approached, Washington readied itself for something like a festival. But this wasn't a celebration. It was a declaration of the right to live in fairness. And then, on August 28, 1963, as the crowds poured into the Capitol, every calculation, every map, every list came to life. Randolph stood before the public. Rustin watched from behind the stage, his eyes on every detail, like a musician checking the strings before the concert begins. The success of that day, its astonishing order, its solemn strength, its emotional reach, bore the fingerprints of them both. If King was the voice of the dream, then Randolph and Rustin were the hands that built the stage for that voice to rise. They don't appear on the covers of textbooks as often as King, but without them, the dream might never have been heard so clearly. August 28, 1963 began like any other summer day in Washington, D.C. But from the early morning hours, something felt different. Buses rolled in from the south, trains arrived from the north, groups came by foot, by car, flowing steadily into the city. By noon, it was estimated that over 250,000 people would be present, turning the Capitol into the most crowded stage in the history of the civil rights movement. But it wasn't just a number, it was a sea of people carrying hope, carrying songs, carrying a shared dream. Before the sun grew harsh, the plaza before the Lincoln Memorial was already full. People laid down blankets, held up handmade signs, opened their lunchboxes. On the stone steps, logistics staff checked the massive sound system, wires stretching across the National Mall. From the reflecting pool, sunlight shimmered on the water, casting a scene both solemn and serene. Attendees sat on the grass, shielding themselves with straw hats, fanning themselves with flyers. They had come from everywhere. Steel workers from Pittsburgh, high school students from Alabama, white ministers from Boston, nuns from Chicago, farming families from rural Georgia. All seated together, no dividing lines, no barriers. The music began before the speeches. Church choirs raised their voices, gospel songs carried across the loudspeakers. Songs of the civil rights movement rose like a collective prayer. Anthems like "We Shall Overcome" weren't just music, they were promises, rhythms that knit hundreds of thousands of hearts together. For a moment, each person there no longer felt alone in their daily struggle. They were part of something vast. The event unfolded like a ceremony. There was a program, a list of speakers. Before the politicians and renowned leaders took the stage, the artists stepped forward. Marian Anderson, once denied the right to sing at Constitution Hall due to segregation, now stood before the statue of Lincoln and lifted her voice. Her singing echoed like an unspoken apology and a quiet triumph. Joan Baez, Bob Dylan followed, with folk melodies familiar to a younger generation. The music struck a tone both reverent and intimate, as though the march itself was a symphony for justice. One by one, speakers stepped to the podium, each bringing a message, a story. Some spoke of economic injustice, some demanded voting rights, some recounted lives lived under Jim Crow's weight. These weren't abstract ideas, but lived truths. A farmer denied a loan because of his skin, a worker barred from the union, a student blocked from a decent school. Together, they built a living ledger of grievance, and yet the atmosphere was not chaotic. People listened, silent when needed, cheering when moved. The media had feared unrest from such a massive gathering, but the opposite occurred: a striking order, a peaceful resolve. White-shirted volunteers moved through the crowd with water, guidance, calm presence. Families spread blankets and shared meals. Children laughed. The elderly leaned on canes. Though the air was heavy with heat, it was filled with patience and quiet dignity. On stage, the speeches continued. A young John Lewis, barely in his 20s, spoke with urgency, calling for bolder action. Philip Randolph, composed as ever, reminded the crowd of the dream for economic fairness. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel legend, interwove songs that sent shivers through the audience. Each voice, each verse, laid another brick in the shared house of hope. In the crowd, eyes brimmed, hands clasped. For many, it was the first time they felt truly seen, truly represented, truly part of a shared dream. Someone from the rural South, once chased out of a store, now sat beside someone from cosmopolitan New York. And together, they sang the same song. Class faded, distance faded, even color for a day seemed to fade. And though the day included many famous leaders, the people hadn't come just to hear names. They had come to know they weren't alone. They came to witness that their struggle had grown beyond corners and counties. It had become national. The power of the number, 250,000, wasn't about headlines. It was about each person feeling held by the strength of the many. As the afternoon light slanted toward the reflecting pool, the final speakers stepped forward. Everything had led to this moment: the speeches, the stories, the songs, the sheer presence of that vast, unified crowd. Not with a rallying cry, but with a living experience, a nation gathered. Perhaps for some, the memory that remained wasn't just King's words. Perhaps it was the sound of Mahalia Jackson's voice in the air, or the moment they sang with a stranger beside them, or the feeling of sitting under Lincoln's gaze, watching the sunlight dance on the water, and knowing they belonged to a shared dream. The march wasn't only politics, it was a collective rite, where song, speech, and presence became a kind of worship of justice. That day, Washington was not just the capital of the United States, it became the capital of hope, of the longing for justice. No barbed wire, no rigid police lines, only songs, smiles, and a reverent hush whenever someone began to speak. It was the day a dream began to take shape, not just in words, but in the presence of hundreds of thousands who had come to give it life. That afternoon, the sunlight softened over the plaza before the Lincoln Memorial. Hundreds of thousands had been sitting beneath the sun since morning. Yet instead of leaving, the crowd stayed. There was a slow, settling silence as Martin Luther King Jr. stepped up to the podium. He was not the first speaker of the day, nor the only one, but many had been waiting for this very moment. King, then just 34, wore a simple dark suit and held a prepared manuscript in his hands. He took a deep breath before looking out over the sea of people, his eyes reflecting a quiet mix of exhaustion and resolve. The speech he had planned was titled, "Normalcy Never Again." It had been carefully written, crisp, politically precise. King began to read, his voice steady and strong, never hurried. He spoke of the unfulfilled promise of the Constitution, of checks written for freedom that Black Americans were never allowed to cash. He spoke of injustice, of violence, of doors slammed shut before the hopes of a people. The crowd listened, attentive, in agreement, but the air still held tension, as if everyone was waiting for something more. Among those standing near the podium was Mahalia Jackson, the legendary gospel singer who had already shaken hearts with her voice that morning. Now she stood listening to every word. She had known King for years, not just as a pastor, but as a man who could ignite fire through words. She could tell he was holding back, staying within the frame of his script. Then, in the middle of his speech, she called out, loud enough for him to hear, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." King looked up. He paused. He had spoken of the dream before, in churches in Detroit, but he had never placed it at the center of a national address. Now he glanced down at the pages in his hand and slowly folded them. He set them aside. Clarence Jones, the speechwriter standing nearby, would later say, when he saw King leave the manuscript, he knew something was happening, something no one had prepared for, but that history would never forget. And then King began to speak with a different rhythm. His voice lifted, as if he were preaching now, not to a crowd, but to a congregation, letting his words rise like a refrain. "I have a dream," he said, and cheers rang out. He repeated it again and again, each time layering new meaning, lifting the hope higher. He dreamed of a day when, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners would sit together at the table of brotherhood. He dreamed of a day when his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He dreamed of a day when the South, once thick with hatred, would become a place of justice and freedom. The crowd responded with every line, cheering, crying, raising hands. Some whispered his words aloud, like a prayer. Others simply stood silent, eyes wide as if witnessing a miracle. The atmosphere shifted entirely, from quiet reflection to rising shared belief. King was no longer delivering a political speech. He was guiding a collective dream. He continued, each passage a swelling wave, urgent yet measured. "Let freedom ring," he called, and then listed, mountain by mountain, state by state. From the mighty mountains of New Hampshire, from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. His voice echoed across the plaza, carried by the wind, met by applause and cries from every direction. People later said, in that moment, King wasn't just speaking, he was singing a hymn of justice. And yet, "I Have a Dream" had never been part of the official script. Had Mahalia Jackson not spoken up, perhaps it would never have been said that day. But that moment of improvisation became something immortal, no longer a speech, but a living image of belief, a rhythm that could be remembered, repeated, passed on. When King finished, the crowd erupted, in cheers, in applause, in tears. Some people collapsed under the weight of emotion. Others raised fists. Some reached for the person next to them and simply held on. Everyone knew they had witnessed something rare. Not just a moment in that day, but a moment that would be remembered forever. Reporters rushed to take notes. Photographers captured every angle. Television broadcasts carried it across the country, then across the world. Even those who hadn't been in Washington felt something stir when they watched it later. "I Have a Dream" became a slogan, a melody of a movement. At once simple and profound, specific and universal. Anyone could repeat it, anyone could place themselves within it. Strangely, though the government had feared the march, stationing thousands of police and soldiers nearby, when King spoke of the dream, they stood still, silent and swept along with it. The event ended in perfect calm, no violence, no chaos, only a strange stillness, as though the entire city had exhaled in unison. When King stepped down, many came forward to shake his hand, to embrace him. He smiled quietly, his shirt soaked with sweat, his body tired. Even he may not have known that the words spoken off script that day would become the greatest legacy of his life. Because in the years that followed, when people spoke of King, they didn't quote policy papers. They returned to the words from that afternoon. I have a dream. And so, a moment broke free from the bounds of a speech. It became a music of conscience, echoing from 1963 to today, and still ringing in the unfinished dreams of humanity. As the crowd slowly dispersed after that August day in 1963, Washington returned to its ordinary rhythm. The echo of footsteps faded from the plaza before the Lincoln Memorial, until only a whisper remained. But what had happened that day did not vanish with the noise of hundreds of thousands. It left a resonance in the heart of America, and that resonance could not be erased. I have a dream was no longer just a phrase. It became a promise, an echo, a fixed point to which an entire generation would anchor. And within just 2 years, the political system had no choice but to listen. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It was a turning point, ending the legal foundation of racial segregation in schools, public places, and government institutions. The whites-only and colored signs began to come down. But the law was not just about signs. It meant that a government which had long upheld injustice was now, at least on paper, standing on the side of equity. A year later, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, eliminating barriers like poll taxes and literacy tests, tools long used to block black citizens from voting. For the first time in nearly a century, America's democratic dream widened its reach to those once kept at its margins. Still, these laws were no instant miracle. Change on paper did not mean change in hearts. Across the South, resistance remained fierce. Extremists found ways to hold on to power. Violence erupted, churches were bombed. King and many activists lived under daily threat. But in the midst of this darkness, the light from August 28, 1963, continued to shine. Whenever someone asked why the fight must go on, the words, "I have a dream," were quoted once more. They echoed in classrooms, in churches, in congressional halls. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, many feared the dream had died with him. But the opposite proved true. His death only made the dream more urgent. His funeral, attended by tens of thousands, felt like an extended verse of the anthem that had once filled the Lincoln Plaza. Friends, colleagues, even young people who had never met him said they could still hear that voice. "I have a dream," resounding in their minds. A sentence had survived the man. It had become humanity's own. If we look beyond America, we see the dream did not stand alone. More than a decade before King spoke it aloud in India, Mahatma Gandhi had led a non-violent movement against the British Empire. Gandhi spoke of freedom as an inner strength, that even under beating, under prison, a person could still preserve dignity. King openly acknowledged his debt to Gandhi. His dream of a society built not on force, but on justice, was a continuation of that same philosophy, as though Gandhi had planted the seed in the East and King had watered it to bloom in the West. If we look further back in time, we arrive at Abraham Lincoln. When King stood before the Lincoln Memorial to share his dream, he knew well the shadow he was standing in, that of the president who had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln once said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And a century later, King said that such a nation could only stand if justice and equality became its true foundation. Lincoln had opened the door. King reminded us the road beyond it was still long. And if we look at the present, we know that dream is still incomplete. In recent years, the Black Lives Matter movement has echoed across America. After waves of police violence and black deaths, Millions took to the streets, holding signs, chanting slogans, and again, in many marches, we heard it, "I have a dream." Young people, not yet born in 1963, still see themselves in that vision. It has become a bridge, from Lincoln to King, from King to generations yet to come. What makes this dream so powerful is that it was never just a dream for Black Americans. It belongs to anyone who believes in equality. Immigrants hear in it the promise that their children will be given a fair chance. Women hear in it the longing not to be excluded from politics or the economy. The poor hear hope, that one day it won't be birth but merit that defines worth. And even those who once stood in opposition have slowly come to understand justice for one group is the foundation of justice for all, and the dream crossed borders. In South Africa, when Nelson Mandela rose against apartheid, many compared him to King. In Eastern Europe, when the Berlin Wall still stood, many whispered their own dream of its collapse and remembered Washington. Even in Asia and Latin America in democratic movements, the name Martin Luther King Jr. was not that of an American activist, but a global symbol. If we return to the image that began this journey from sleep to dream to awakening, we begin to see a rhythm running throughout. Medieval sleepers, broken by fear and night. The people of Salem, dreaming of devils and awakening in tears. Fulvia, the forgotten Roman woman, living inside the nightmare of power. And then Washington, where the dream was no longer an illusion, but a call to awaken. From the damp straw beds of medieval Europe to the bright white plaza beneath Lincoln's gaze, history has circled far to bring us to a place where dreams no longer torment us, but guide us like maps. If Fulvia was scorned for daring to rule, King was honored for daring to dream. If Salem ended in late apologies, Washington opened with a promise. If ancient dreams were seen as omens of demons, modern dreams became symbols of hope. The contrast reminds us that history is not a chain of random events, but a current, in which our dreams and sleep reflect the soul of each era. King's dream, as many scholars have said, remains unfinished, but perhaps that is its essence. A dream fulfilled disappears. But a dream still unfolding, repeated, passed on, becomes a driving force. Not a conclusion, but a refrain. And that refrain, from 1963 until now, still echoes, still reminds us that every generation carries the responsibility to bring it closer to reality. Some say that if Gandhi sowed the seed, Lincoln opened the door, and King sang the song, then we are the ones tending the garden. Justice does not bloom in one season, but over centuries. And as long as injustice remains, as long as difference becomes cause for dismissal, as long as people are devalued for being born unlike others, then the dream must be spoken again. And so we close this long journey. From broken sleep in the Middle Ages, through the nightmares of Salem, through the shadow of a forgotten Roman woman, to the collective dream at Washington, a path from darkness to light, from drifting to waking, from fear to hope, and still, the dream continues, not just in America, but anywhere people long to live as equals, as humans, as free. And so, our long wandering comes to an end. From medieval villages, stirring in the dark, to the panic of Salem nights, to Fulvia standing defiant in Rome, and finally to Martin Luther King Jr., lifting a dream before thousands. We've seen how sleep, fear, and dreams are woven through history. What began as broken nights in straw beds ended as a vision of equality still alive today. It reminds us that the human story is never just about kings or wars, but about the quiet rhythms of life, the hopes whispered in the dark, and the dreams that refuse to die. If you enjoyed this journey, remember you can subscribe to Historian Sleepy 365 for more boring history for sleep. Every week, another long, slow story from the past, told not to excite you, but to help you rest. For now, let the echoes of history fade into silence. Breathe slow. Let the dream continue wherever you are. Good night.